The Silk Road was never a single road, nor was it defined by silk alone. Yet few systems in human history have reshaped the world so quietly and so completely. Emerging gradually rather than by decree, the Silk Road was a vast, shifting network of land and sea routes. It connected East Asia to the Mediterranean long before globalization had a name. Its origins can be traced to the Han Dynasty of China in the 2nd century BCE. Imperial ambition collided with geography, curiosity, and necessity. The Chinese sought horses strong enough to challenge nomadic rivals on their northern borders. In doing so, they opened pathways westward into Central Asia. What followed was not an empire of conquest, but an empire of exchange. Across deserts that swallowed caravans whole and mountain passes that tested human endurance, traders carried goods. Pilgrims, diplomats, and wanderers carried ideas and beliefs across continents. Silk became the most famous commodity, not because it was the most important, but because it embodied what the Silk Road represented: rarity, desire, and transformation. Chinese silk dazzled Roman elites who had no idea how it was made. Its production remained a closely guarded secret for centuries. Alongside silk traveled spices, jade, glassware, gold, ivory, paper, gunpowder, and eventually knowledge itself. The Silk Road did not flatten cultures into sameness, it braided them together. Cities rose where routes converged: Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, Merv. Not merely as markets, but as cultural crossroads where languages overlapped. Religions debated and technologies collided. Crucially, the Silk Road thrived not because of centralized control, but because of fragmentation. No single empire ruled it for long, yet many benefited from it. The Parthians, Kushans, Sogdians, Tang Chinese, Abbasid Caliphate, and later the Mongols all shaped its flow, sometimes stabilizing it, sometimes disrupting it, but never owning it outright. This decentralized nature made the Silk Road resilient. When one route became dangerous, another emerged. When one empire fell, another took its place. It was less a highway and more a living system, adapting to political shifts, climate change, and human ambition. In this sense, the Silk Road was not an achievement of any one civilization, but a collective human response to distance. It proved that even in an ancient world defined by isolation and hardship, connection was not only possible, it was inevitable. To understand the Silk Road fully, one must confront the brutal reality beneath its romance. This was not a smooth exchange of luxury goods gliding effortlessly across continents, but a dangerous, grinding process powered by human endurance and constant risk. Caravans moved slowly, often no more than 20 miles a day, bound together by necessity rather than trust. Merchants rarely traveled the full length of the Silk Road. Instead, goods changed hands dozens of times. Goods passed through intermediaries who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and lived under different laws. The backbone of this system was the camel, particularly the Bactrian camel. Its ability to survive extreme cold, blistering heat, and long periods without water made transcontinental trade possible. Even so, entire caravans vanished into deserts like the Taklamakan. Banditry was constant, taxation was unavoidable, and political instability could collapse a route overnight. Empires understood both the value and vulnerability of these trade arteries. When stable powers emerged, such as the Tang dynasty in China or the Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world, the Silk Road flourished. Roads were patrolled, caravanserais were built, and merchants were protected. This was not out of charity, but because trade meant revenue, prestige, and access to foreign technologies. These roadside inns became some of the most important institutions of the Silk Road. They offered food, shelter, information, and news. They were also places where ideas spread as freely as goods. A merchant might arrive with silk and leave with a new religious belief, a medical technique, or a story. Yet the Silk Road also carried darker cargo. Alongside spices and scriptures traveled disease. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the 14th century, moved along Silk Road routes. It was transmitted through fleas and rats carried by caravans and ships. The same networks that connected civilizations also exposed their shared vulnerability. Empires rose by mastering these routes and fell when they lost control of them. The Kushan Empire became wealthy by bridging India, Central Asia, and China. The Sogdians, though never forming a great empire, became legendary as middlemen. Their linguistic skill and commercial networks made them indispensable. Later, the Mongol Empire imposed a brutal but effective order over much of Eurasia. This created what historians call the Pax Mongolica. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road reached one of its greatest peaks, allowing figures like Marco Polo to travel from Venice to China. But this stability came at enormous human cost, enforced by violence on a scale the world had rarely seen. The Silk Road was never purely benevolent. It rewarded adaptability, punished weakness, and demanded constant negotiation between profit and survival. It was a system built not on ideals but on incentives. And yet, through that harsh machinery, cultures learned to see beyond their own horizons. If goods were the visible cargo of the Silk Road, then ideas were its most enduring passengers. Long before printing presses or mass communication, the Silk Road functioned as humanity's greatest ideological transmission system, carrying religions, philosophies, and worldviews across immense distances. Buddhism was among the first major belief systems to spread this way. Originating in the Indian subcontinent, it moved northward through the Kushan Empire and into Central Asia, where monks, merchants, and pilgrims carried sutras across deserts and mountains. Cave complexes like Dunhuang and Bamiyan became spiritual way stations, carved with images and texts that blended Indian, Persian, Greek, and Chinese artistic traditions. By the time Buddhism reached China, it was no longer purely Indian. It had transformed, adapting to Confucian ethics and Taoist cosmology. This process of transformation was not accidental. The Silk Road demanded adaptability. A belief system that could not translate itself across cultures simply did not survive the journey. Christianity also traveled these routes long before it became dominant in Europe. Nestorian Christian communities established themselves in Persia, Central Asia, and even Tang Dynasty China, where inscriptions record churches operating openly under imperial tolerance. Islam later followed, expanding rapidly across Silk Road corridors after the 7th century. Muslim merchants did not arrive solely as conquerors, but as traders whose faith traveled with their contracts, customs, and daily practices. Mosques rose beside markets, and Islamic law influenced trade ethics, contracts, and trust networks across Eurasia. What made the Silk Road unique was not just the spread of religions, but their coexistence. In cities like Samarkand or Kashgar, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, Christians, Jews, Manichaeans, and Muslims lived within walking distance of one another. This proximity produced debate, synthesis, and sometimes tension, but it also forced civilizations to confront difference as a constant reality. Philosophical texts traveled alongside sacred ones. Greek works preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars returned to Europe centuries later through translation movements in places like Toledo. This reshaped medieval European thought. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and ethics crossed borders quietly, often without acknowledgement of origin. The Silk Road thus undermines the idea of isolated intellectual traditions. No civilization developed its worldview in a vacuum. Even concepts of governance and kingship were influenced by foreign models, adapted to local needs. Yet belief was not merely transmitted, it was contested. Empires sometimes suppressed certain faiths while promoting others, understanding that belief could unify or destabilize populations. The Tang dynasty alternated between religious tolerance and persecution depending on political pressures. Islamic rulers debated philosophy's role within theology. Christian authorities later sought to reclaim intellectual authority over ideas that had passed through Islamic hands. Through it all, the Silk Road remained indifferent. It carried belief, not because belief was sacred, but because humans were mobile, curious, and searching for meaning beyond their immediate world. In this sense, the Silk Road was not just a commercial network, but a spiritual experiment, one that proved ideas could travel farther than armies and last longer than empires. The most transformative exchanges along the Silk Road were often invisible, unfolding not in marketplaces but in workshops, libraries, and mines. Technologies moved west and east through imitation rather than instruction, often without their original inventors receiving recognition. Paper is one of the clearest examples. Invented in China during the Han Dynasty, paper traveled slowly westward, guarded as a strategic resource. When Chinese paper makers were captured after the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, the knowledge of paper production entered the Islamic world. It was refined and mass-produced in cities like Baghdad and Samarkand. From there, it eventually reached Europe, revolutionizing record-keeping, education, and administration. Without this transfer, the later explosion of literacy and bureaucracy in Europe would have been impossible. Gunpowder followed a similar path. First developed in China as an alchemical experiment, it became a weapon through centuries of adaptation. Islamic scholars documented its properties and military uses, while Europeans later transformed it into cannons and firearms that reshaped warfare. Navigation technologies also crossed Silk Road networks. The magnetic compass, advanced shipbuilding techniques, and astronomical instruments allowed sailors to travel farther and more accurately, extending Silk Road principles into maritime routes. Medicine, too, was deeply shaped by Silk Road exchange. Greek medical texts preserved by Islamic scholars merged with Persian, Indian, and Chinese knowledge to form comprehensive medical systems. Figures like Avicenna synthesized this information into works that dominated European medicine for centuries. These were not simple handoffs of knowledge, but layered processes of experimentation, translation, and reinvention. Crucially, the Silk Road blurred the line between inventor and transmitter. Many cultures became known for technologies they refined rather than originated. The Islamic Golden Age thrived not because it invented everything from scratch, but because it valued preservation, commentary, and improvement. Europe's later scientific revolution rested heavily on this accumulated knowledge, even as it often erased its sources. Yet technological exchange also created dependency and imbalance. States that failed to adapt to new technologies fell behind militarily and economically. Those that embraced innovation gained leverage. The Silk Road rewarded openness and punished isolation. At the same time, it exposed a paradox. Progress often arrived through conflict. Battles, conquests, and collapses forced the movement of skilled workers, texts, and techniques. Knowledge was sometimes stolen, sometimes gifted, and sometimes extracted under duress. The Silk Road was not a neutral conduit of progress. It was a system shaped by power. Still, its long-term effect was unmistakable. By linking distant civilizations into a shared technological ecosystem, it accelerated human development beyond what any single region could have achieved alone. The modern world, with its global supply chains, shared scientific standards, and interdependent economies, is not a break from Silk Road logic, but its continuation. The routes have changed, the speed has increased, but the principle remains the same. Knowledge moves, adapts, and reshapes whoever dares to carry it. No force reshaped the Silk Road more dramatically or more violently than the rise of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century. What began as a confederation of nomadic tribes on the Mongolian steppe exploded into the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the shores of the Pacific to the edges of Eastern Europe. To many of their contemporaries, the Mongols were a nightmare unleashed. Cities burned, populations annihilated, entire regions depopulated. Yet paradoxically, it was this brutal expansion that produced one of the most stable and interconnected periods the Silk Road had ever known. Under Mongol rule, vast stretches of Eurasia were unified under a single political framework, allowing trade, travel, and communication to flourish on an unprecedented scale. Historians refer to this era as the Pax Mongolica, a period in which merchants could travel thousands of miles under Mongol protection. They carried official passports known as paisa that granted them safe passage, supplies, and lodging. Roads were repaired, caravanserais expanded, and relay stations established to facilitate rapid communication across the empire. For the first time, the Silk Road functioned as a near-continuous system rather than a patchwork of regional routes. This unification enabled the large-scale movement of people as well as goods. Artisans, engineers, doctors, and scholars were forcibly relocated across the empire to serve Mongol needs. This unintentionally created one of history's greatest exchanges of technical expertise. Chinese engineers helped build siege weapons in the Middle East. Persian administrators influenced governance in China. European travelers like Marco Polo reached the court of Kublai Khan. They offered the West its first detailed descriptions of East Asian society. Yet this global moment came at a steep cost. Mongol warfare devastated agricultural systems, displaced millions, and destabilized ecosystems. The same networks that allowed trade to flourish also accelerated the spread of disease. Most catastrophically, the Black Death traveled from Central Asia to Europe along Silk Road and maritime routes. It killed an estimated third of Europe's population. The Mongol Empire's collapse was as rapid as its rise. Internal divisions, succession crises, and regional fragmentation shattered the unified system. But the damage and the transformation was already done. The idea that the world could be interconnected on a continental scale had moved from abstraction to reality. The Mongols did not invent globalization, but they proved it was possible, even in a pre-modern world. Their empire marked the Silk Road's peak, a moment when distance shrank and the fate of civilizations became visibly intertwined. The Silk Road did not collapse overnight. It faded, reshaped by forces that redefined how the world connected. As Mongol authority fractured in the late 14th century, the security that had sustained long-distance overland trade eroded. Routes became dangerous again, fragmented by competing states and local conflicts. At the same time, new powers were rising, and with them came new technologies and priorities. Maritime trade began to eclipse overland routes as ships grew larger, navigation improved, and sea travel became more efficient. European powers, motivated by the desire to bypass Silk Road intermediaries and gain direct access to Asian goods, turned outward toward the oceans. The Portuguese voyages along the African coast, followed by Spanish, Dutch, and English expansion, shifted the center of global trade from land to sea. This transition did not eliminate the Silk Road, but it diminished its dominance. Central Asian cities that had thrived for centuries declined, while port cities rose in their place. Yet the Silk Road's influence did not vanish, it transformed. The patterns of exchange it established became embedded in emerging global systems. Ideas about trade regulation, currency, diplomacy, and cultural exchange carried forward into the modern era. Even colonial expansion followed Silk Road logic. Control the routes, control the flow of wealth and knowledge. Ironically, the very success of the Silk Road contributed to its obsolescence. By spreading technologies like navigation, shipbuilding, and cartography, it enabled the rise of maritime empires that would eventually replace it. The legacy of the Silk Road is thus deeply ambivalent. It connected humanity while exposing its vulnerabilities, accelerated progress while amplifying inequality, and fostered exchange while enabling exploitation. Modern globalization echoes these same tensions. Supply chains span continents, cultures intermingle, and crises ripple outward with alarming speed, just as they did centuries ago. The Silk Road reminds us that global connection is not inherently moral or immoral, it is powerful. How that power is used depends on the systems and values that govern it. In studying the Silk Road, we are not looking at a dead network of ancient paths, but at the prototype of our own interconnected world. Its rise and decline offer a warning as much as a lesson. Connection can elevate civilizations, but without stability, empathy, and foresight, it can just as easily hasten their unraveling. The Silk Road did not disappear, it dissolved into the world itself. What once took months of perilous travel by camel caravan now moves in seconds through fiber optic cables, shipping lanes, and digital networks, but the underlying logic remains unchanged. The Silk Road was never about silk nor even trade. It was about connection, friction, and transformation. It revealed a truth that still defines human history. Civilizations do not rise in isolation, and they do not fall alone. Every major shift along the Silk Road, economic, religious, technological, or political, was the result of interaction, not invention in a vacuum. The modern world often frames globalization as a recent phenomenon. Yet the Silk Road demonstrates that humanity has been experimenting with global systems for over 2,000 years. What has changed is scale, speed, and consequence. The ancient Silk Road moved slowly enough for cultures to adapt over generations. Today, ideas and crises move faster than institutions can respond. Power concentrates around routes of exchange. States compete to control infrastructure. Knowledge spreads unevenly, creating innovation in some regions and dependency in others. Even cultural anxiety, fear of foreign influence, moral decline, or loss of identity echoes the debates that once played out in caravan cities from Chang'an to Constantinople. The Silk Road also challenges modern assumptions about ownership of progress. Technologies we label as Western or Eastern are often the result of centuries of shared development, refinement, and transmission. Paper, mathematics, medicine, navigation, and philosophy all emerged from collaborative human processes shaped by movement and contact. The Silk Road exposes the myth of civilizational purity and replaces it with a more complex reality. Cultures are strongest when they are porous. At the same time, the Silk Road warns against romanticizing connection. It carried disease as efficiently as it carried ideas, exploitation alongside opportunity, and domination alongside exchange. Its history reminds us that global systems magnify both human ingenuity and human cruelty. The question has never been whether the world should be connected, but how that connection is structured and who benefits from it. In the end, the Silk Road's greatest legacy is not a map of ancient routes, but a lesson written into the modern age. Every society is both a traveler and a destination. We inherit knowledge shaped by distant hands, and we pass forward consequences we may never see. The Silk Road teaches that history is not a straight line of progress, but a web of encounters, fragile, powerful, and irreversible. To understand it is to recognize that the world has always been shared, and that the paths we walk today were laid long ago by footsteps in the dust.